Good morning, Year 3, and welcome to your first lesson of the summer term in topic. In English this term, you are going to be learning all about the American Civil Rights Movement, where Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King led people to fight against inequality and lack of integration. But before that, I thought it would be very useful if our first topic lesson was a history lesson that put that kind of thing into a bit of context, so you know why America needed the civil rights movement, where segregation came from, and what happened to turn that into the position it was in. So this is what we're going to be learning. We're going to look at the reasons why Britain colonised America, explain why the American Civil War took place, look at the American War of Independence, and see what we've learned, which led to the Civil Rights Movement. In 1492, Christopher Columbus was an Italian explorer, and he discovered America, which is a bit weird really, because there'd been an indigenous population living there for many thousands of years. And in fact, recently there's even been evidence that the Vikings reached North America hundreds of years before. But at that time, in 1492, Europe was colonizing lots of parts of the world, and Christopher Columbus discovered a new land called America, and decided that it would be really great for Europeans to colonize it. In 1607, Britain established its first colony in America, a place called Jamestown, which is now in Virginia. The people working in the colony were mainly Native American slaves. The people they'd found living in America, they turned them into slaves and they made them work for them, transported criminals, broke the law in Europe, and their punishment was to be sent away. All white European servants who were paid to come and work there. In 1661, a new law was passed to make it illegal for people from different races to actually marry. So black people weren't allowed to marry white people, Indian people weren't allowed to marry black people, etc. So it was already a time when there was a lot of racial tension, and people were divided greatly along racial lines. Then started the slave trade from Africa. So the reasons Britain established the colony, well, first of all, obviously economic. They wanted to become wealthy, and the best way of becoming wealthy was to exploit natural resources of the countries that they took over. Obviously, America was a vast land with really good land for growing crops, mining, resources, etc. So it made sense for Britain to establish colonies and start exploiting those resources. It also made sense politically. The more powerful, the more land and people you controlled, the more powerful you could become. And at the time, a lot of European countries were trying to establish empires, and Britain was no different. They wanted to have a big empire with lots and lots of power. And there were also religious reasons. Europeans at the time believed that Christianity was the only religion and the only way to get to heaven, and therefore they felt that if they colonized these countries, they could turn people Christian. And if you like, they were doing them a favour because they could actually get to heaven. So they honestly thought that they were doing them a favour, as well as obviously doing themselves a favour by becoming very wealthy, by taking over the lands that they found. The slave trade then grew up. Slaves were brought from Africa. People were thrown onto ships in North Africa and made to work in the fields of the southern states of North America, the southern parts of North America. They needed cheap labour. They needed cheap labour to grow crops, rice and cotton mainly, and then transport them back to Europe. And the cheaper the labour, the better it was. And obviously slaves, you have to feed them, but you don't have to pay them anything else. And so that made sense. By 1776, over half of the population of South Carolina were actually African slaves. These people didn't have a choice. 12 million African people were transported to America in ships, herded in. Once they got to America, they were sold to the highest bidder. Many of them didn't make it. Many of them died en route, or their bodies were just thrown overboard. Many were found dead when they opened up the holes in the ships to see where they'd put them. They were just used as a human cargo. And those that did survive were worked very hard on the land. They were sold to people who owned land and wanted to make money through farming. By 1775, 13 of the American colonies felt they actually wanted independence from Britain. They didn't want to pay taxes, they didn't want all their wealth going to Britain, and they wanted to actually rule themselves. They felt it was important to have self-rule rather than just to be a small offshoot of Britain, providing money and resources to help the British economy. The war started, and in fact, black soldiers fought on both sides, both the British sides and the American sides, because both sides promised anyone who signed up to fight for them, if they were a black slave, could have their freedom if they joined their armies, after the war. The war lasted that led to the establishment of the United States of America. But this didn't actually end slavery. The United States was still very keen on slavery because it did still provided cheap labor for them. In 1806, the slave trade was banned, which meant there were no more slaves brought over from Africa. But that was probably because they could actually then provide for themselves. They've got so many slaves over. The slaves were having their own families. The children of those families were slaves themselves and could be bought and sold at will. So we're probably providing enough of their own slaves not to need to actually trade fresh slaves from Africa. They were basically growing their own, just like any other crop, as you would consider it. Now, obviously, we don't think that humans should be considered as a crop or a resource like that, but that's certainly how they were feeling. In fact, slavery was not banned. 8 out of the first 12 American presidents actually owned slaves themselves. The North American states banned slavery mainly because their economies were based on other things and they didn't really need it. It was only in the South where they were growing so many crops they really needed the cheap labor to do that. So North American, there was obviously a big divide, and the North Americans felt that slavery was unnecessary. By 1860, though, 7 states broke away from the Union and formed the Confederacy. These were mainly the slave-owning states down in the South, and this led to a civil war because they wanted to keep slavery and the North wanted to end slavery. But by 1865, the Unionists had won, the Confederate states were put down, and slavery was abolished and ended. But this didn't stop racism. This certainly didn't stop people not wanting to support black people. In fact, in the 1890s, America suffered a really deep economic recession. There was people were losing their jobs, and many white people, particularly in the South, lost a lot of money when slavery was abolished, and they then had to pay, even though they paid their workers very little, they still had to pay them, and they now feared losing their jobs to black people who were a source of cheap labor. And so there was a lot of tension. In fact, a secret white supremacist organization, an organization that honestly believed that white people were better than black people, called the Ku Klux Klan, was formed, and they led terrorist attacks against the black community. They hanged people, they burnt down their farmsteads, they tried to chase them away, they treated them appallingly. So in order to stop this, or to stop the two societies fighting each other, many southern states passed laws segregating black and white people. So where they were supposed to be equal in the eyes of the law, they lived in very separate communities, in very separate areas. These were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was a name given by white people to former black slaves, and it was a bit of a put-down, it was a bit of an insult, really. It became illegal for African Americans, black people, to drink from the same water fountains, to eat at the same restaurants, to sit at the same seats on a bus. They had to attend different schools to white Americans. There were even separate prisons, hospitals, orphanages. They basically lived very, very separate lives. And these separate lives were ingrained in law, so that white people and black people really were not supposed to mix. And that's what grew to, in the 1950s, this was still happening. Some black people weren't even allowed to vote, and they had to live in separate areas, and they were very much being treated as second-class citizens in some of the southern states. Obviously, many black people migrated north to the states which offered more equality. They got out, but a lot of black people didn't have the economic power to do that, couldn't do that, and so had to stay put. And it was against this background that the civil rights movement grew to try and get some equality. So that's why it all happened, really. In America today, a lot of progress has been made, but it is still quite a racist society. In 2017, average incomes in white households were $171,000 a year. In black households, $17,100, so only 10%. And this is because although when the slaves were freed, they weren't given a great deal of access to wealth or ways of making money. They were still the poorest of society, and they still had the poorest jobs. And we still see that today. 58% of Americans say race relations in the USA are bad. 80% of Black Americans still feel that there is a legacy of slavery and it affects their lives today. So although we've seen improvements, it certainly isn't the end of segregation and racism in America. There's still a long way to go. These are some videos you might want to watch. If you pause the video here, you'll be able to write down these addresses and watch some videos, and you might enjoy those. And your task is, if you want, maybe you could make a placard to use on a demonstration to support the American Civil Rights Movement, and then maybe write a letter. Imagine it's 1861 and the new President Lincoln has come into power, and your job is to write to him a letter explaining why you think he should abolish slavery in the United States. You need to look at the arguments for keeping slavery and then argue against it, and you'll need to make sure that you use all the persuasive elements you've learned about writing letters. So your task is to write a short letter to our new president in 1861 of the United States to say why you should end slavery. Of course, if you don't think they should, you could write a letter to say why they should continue slavery, but I think that might be a bit harder. When you've done that, you might want to get an adult to upload it to Tapestry, so I can have a read of it, or maybe add it to our TLAP Instagram account, or even put it on our Facebook page so we can share your work and see what you've done. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I'll be back with science lessons later. Bye.